What's going on, party people? It's your friend Mike King. I'm about ready to get started. Just want to make sure everybody out there can hear me just fine, and we'll get this kicked off in a good minute. All right. Oh, wow, that looks crazy. So I'd ask you if you could see my screen, but while I'm sharing my screen, I can't see what you're talking about. So let me just double check. Yep. Okay, cool. We're good to go. All right. So, some of you may have actually seen me give this presentation live a couple times. It's been my tour deck, so to speak, for the year. And some of you that may have seen me at MozCon know that I talked about some of these things last year as well when I was talking about, you don't know SEO. So, really, what I've been talking about this year is really how can you further optimize your content so that it's more performant, really within the expectations, the statistical expectations of search engines. So without further ado, let's get into it with a couple of disclaimers. So one, nobody knows Google's algorithms. I mean, at this point, it's I'd be hard pressed to believe that there's like one engineer that can tell you everything about how Google works. Two, patents are not an indication that anything is currently in use. It's an indication that people have thought about it and, have been meaningful about their approach to it and have considered actually using it, but it doesn't indicate that they're necessarily in use. And finally, I'm not aiming to offend anyone with this presentation. At this point in my career, it's kind of funny that I have to say that, but here we are. Okay, so let's talk a bit about search engine expectations and how they effectively see content. So I posted this tweet, I don't know, about a year ago at this point. Yeah, almost exactly a year ago. And I said, thinking in terms of hacking, I wonder if Google's algorithms have always been more elegant than we thought, and we've just been using links as the equivalent of brute force password cracking. There have probably always been better exploits. We've just over indexed on links. So, what do I mean by that? What I mean is that, we at some point as SEOs found out that links work so well. And the reality is that there's likely some other vectors that are being considered when search engines are calculating how well something ranks. And so, because we as an industry have over indexed on this idea of links, we think that links are the thing that work the best, but I don't know if that's necessarily the case. So I believe that our correlation studies are more showcasing our bias rather than necessarily the bias of Google. So if everyone is focusing on one thing and the things that rank are also focusing on that one thing, then it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, so to speak, that will be the thing that has the highest correlation with performance. The other thing is that we talk about PageRank as a concept, but one, I don't know that our industry truly ever understood it. And I think that's evidenced in how we approach the metrics that we've created. And so, we talk about PageRank. Um, the simplest version of it when it first came out was largely about link volume. And additionally, Google cares far more than just about link volume. They care about relevance on both sides of that link. So ideally, you would have parity between what's being discussed on what you're linking to versus where you're getting the link from. Parity on that source and that target. But again, we are so oriented around volume, like how many links can we build so we can beat our competitor? Our metrics, despite the fact that people will say like, oh yeah, it's measuring quality, it's measuring trust, it's measuring all these other things, most of our metrics are largely talking about volume. So except for Majestic, Majestic does a pretty good job in that they've got citation trust flow, which has an indication of, what are sites about, the topical trust flow, things like that as well. But Google has for a very long time had a topic sensitive page rank. And so it's not just about the volume of links, it's about, again, the parity between the source and the target. So really understanding that Google will process this page you're getting your link from to determine what is this about. And so if you're getting a bunch of links from bakery sites, but you are a e-commerce site that doesn't sell anything having to do with bakeries, that link doesn't matter as much as one that's going to be about whatever it is that you're actually selling. So, end of the day, we as SEOs, we are all just oriented around get as many links as possible because we know more links is better. And then you hear search engines saying, like, hey, actually, if you get one or two links that are relevant links, you may see direct impacts. And they're saying that because of the fact that they are looking for parity on both sides. So I think that there is value in understanding how information retrieval works so that we can better understand how to position our content so that it meets the expectations of search engines. And just from a high level, the way that information retrieval works is that you'll crawl and index a page or however you index a page. We're not just necessarily talking about, search engines like Google, but when we talk about information retrieval, that is. But what it comes down to is you take a document, you break that document into its smallest pieces. The concept is called tokenization. So you take an article, turn it into sentences, break those sentences into words, and then tag the words for parts of speech, determine entities, and determine the relationships between all of that, content that you've broken down to its atomic size. So, end of the day, SEO is still asking the question of how long should content be? Frankly, that's the wrong question. It's really how do we make that content more relevant, no matter what the length of it is? How do we make it more relevant to the expectations of a search engine? So Google has a mechanism very similar to what I just showed you a couple slides ago. This is essentially their process as it's illustrated in a patent where they talk about how they will have their document repository. They've got all these other different subsystems that they use to leverage understanding based on the context that they've built over time. So on one side, you've got them processing the query to better understand what the user meant, but you're also processing documents against that user context or that contextual context they've built over time with all this information that they've stored through many years of doing this. But again, we still say, oh, yeah, just make great content. And I'm not saying that's necessarily our fault. That's what we've been told by search engines for years. Just make great content. We'll figure it out. But the reality is, a lot of the mechanisms that they're using to understand content is available open source or through a variety of different tools. So leveraging those tools ourselves will allow us to understand that context and build off it as well. So what search engines do, and this is specifically from Google, these screenshots you're seeing here, is again, they will score documents based on their features, based on their links as well. So as you're seeing in this diagram above, they may take a page or a document, break it down into a series of different features and understand the concepts within that document, and then score each of those components. Then they score the other features like links, like how often that content is updated, and then they come up with an aggregate score. So those aggregate scores are happening in the background for each page that's being considered for rankings. And another thing to note is that Google's file system is built in such a way where they can index copies or versions of your content effectively forever. And my hypothesis around this is why, or I believe that this is the reason why when you do a 301 redirect between one page or another, if there's no parity between those, they may not count that value of the links that you're 301 redirecting because they have older versions of your page, just like the Wayback Machine, effectively forever. But that's kind of an aside. So when we talk about Google's algorithm, what we're really talking about is not just one thing. Google is made up of a series of microservices that inform how a page is constructed. But more specifically, when we say algorithm, what we're really talking about is Google's scoring functions. At any given moment, there may be, any number of scoring functions that is running on your query, on the documents related to your query, and they may choose one scoring function versus the other depending on your context or depending on which one returns the best set of results. So ultimately, even if we knew all of Google's scoring functions, we wouldn't necessarily know which one was being used at any given time. So let's talk a little bit more about document scoring and how it may work, just in a simplified version. So imagine that we've got a content factor, another content factor, a speed factor, and then two link factors, right? So adding all this up, you would ultimately get your document score. But wait, it gets worse. Each of these components has a weight. Each component to the equation has a weight. So imagine there is this first content factor, which has a weight associated with it, and then the second one, and then the speed factor, and then the link factor. And again, please note that this is a very simplified version of this. I would imagine that since we always hear about them having, over 200 factors, this could be an equation that is very long to determine these document scores. So what happens is the weights may look something like this. So let's say this first content factor has a weight of 3, and then the second content factor has one of 6, and then you've got the speed factor, which is 1, and then you've got 2s for both of the link factors that we're talking about. So what SEOs do, because we believe that links are the most important thing, is that we put as much as we can into that link factor, build as many links possible. And so ultimately, let's say these are the numbers that break down. You've got the content factor where yours is a 5, and then it's multiplied by 3 for the weight on that one. And then the other content factor is a 2, it's multiplied by 6, and so on. But what we really do is we'll put so much effort into that link factor. So it may be a 95. And then the other link factor may be a 74. And then the aggregate score there is a 369. That may be great, depending on what's relatively happening with other documents being considered for that query. But then what Google does is they turn down the weight on those link factors because of the fact that what you're doing is offsetting the quality of the results. So this may be what happens when they're making adjustments to their scoring functions, where they're saying, okay, these people are building way too many links here. We're not seeing enough value with respect to the good content that we're seeing. But if we change this dial just a bit, then ultimately we end up seeing something different. So in those cases, again, that's where the value of your document score goes down pretty dramatically. Somebody's calling me on Google Voice, and I don't want to drop the window so I can close my Gmail, but it's very distracting. So really what I'm saying here is that the thing that we can directly focus on pretty easily would be the content optimization. So imagine we focus very heavily on those content factors and did as well as we could. Imagine we did 100 for each one of those, and then we kept links where they are because we're going to continue to do what we do on the link side. But if we focus more on the content where we have more control and we have a more direct understanding of what Google is doing, then we may get much higher scores there, and then you may end up ranking much better. So another point that I want to think about is that Google is always evaluating and experimenting. And so when we have this discussion about how clicks may or may not impact ranking, I think we're having a semantic discussion, because Google will always say like, hey, we use clicks for evaluation and experimentation, but these are also pretty noisy signals. And so they have their own proprietary metric, CAS. I can't remember exactly what it stands for, but I know that Bill Slawski wrote about it. It's effectively a composite score that is an indication of the satisfaction of the user for any given query. So bottom line is, no matter how you slice it, looking at the user response to your result in the SERPs is an indication of satisfaction, and it is something that Google is looking at, and they do consistently evaluate that. And there's also, if you look on the Google ad side, is also evidence that there are click-through rate expectations. So if your ad is ranking in the first position, but it's not getting clicked enough, that's an indication that you should be pushed down because you're just not as good as a result as they believed you were. So why would they not be thinking about this from an organic side when they are so focused on driving the best quality of search results possible? I think it's unrealistic to believe that there's not a specific expectation for different positions from a click-through rate perspective. And that being said, why don't we A/B test our metadata? If there are things that we can be doing to drive that click-through rate up, why would we not be doing that? I can't tell you how many times that we have made adjustments to metadata and seen higher clicks, even though positions did not change. And then ultimately, that knock-on effect is that those positions do end up changing over time. I'm not going to necessarily say that it's a direct result of that increase in click-through rate, because we're obviously very rarely doing things in a vacuum. But nevertheless, that's an indication that there's value in A/B testing our metadata. So Google also looks at entities for any query, and they're also looking at entities on the content side as well. But I think they do a great job of illustrating the entity idea with the infographic you see on the right. Well, I'm hesitant to call it infographic. It's just an image. But nevertheless, the query is, who is the U.S. president when the Angels won the World Series? And that's broken down to a list of presidents, a country, a baseball team, World Series winners by year, presidents of the United States. So there's all this context that can be leveraged in understanding what you're asking for. Google also uses the attributes of these entities to indicate or inform the context of what you're looking for. And also they use it to verify, whether or not content makes sense. So the entities are extracted from both your query, and they're also extracted from your content to then inform what should rank. So we talk a lot about entities in this conceptual mindset, but what tools are there for entity strategy for SEO? To my knowledge, there are no SEO tools that help you understand entities and you help you develop a strategy around them. I think that's a bit of a shortcoming for the SEO tool space. And it really requires an understanding of data science to really get into the nitty gritty there. Another thing is that intent for keywords will change over time. And I'm actually seeing a lot more discussion about this in my stream on Twitter, where more and more people are showing examples of how a query once triggered one set of results, and then suddenly it triggers a different set of results with knowledge graph and so on and so forth. And I think Kane Jameson has been doing some great work as of late around how do we understand the different intents based on SERP features and so on. So I think it's very helpful for us to understand, we can't just set and forget our keyword research. We have to continually be pulling that data. And the best way to do that is to pull from the SERPs on a regular basis. And a lot of rank tracking tools will tell you a bit more about those SERP features, so you can use those as ways to determine filters and such programmatically in your keyword research and your rank tracking, so that you can better understand when things have flipped and when and why they may have flipped. So when I say technical content optimization, I think of it as a multi-dimensional word game. There's just so many different components that a search engine can look at. There's so many things that are understood by the computer science behind how search engines operate. And there's just so much data that we can leverage to build content in this really complex way. But as an industry, we really just don't know what we're doing. And it's okay if you're laughing in your chair right now. So, big problem is that there's just a lot of missing understanding about how this stuff works in our industry. And really what we're talking about is different fields. We're talking about computational linguistics, natural language processing, which, depending who you ask, may be the same thing. We're talking about graph theory. We're talking about information retrieval. All these different data-driven, science ideas that have lived in our space for a long time, because they're the components by which we've built search engines on and continue to grow their capabilities, and what really SEO is a user of. We are really the users of these interfaces. We're power users and such, and we should really be thinking as though we are search engineers. and I really should cut off all my alerts when I'm doing webinars, but judge me if you want. So when we talk about natural language processing, there's a variety of different use cases for that. There's machine translation, which we've heard a lot more about with Google Translate getting more effective. We're seeing, it's supporting information retrieval, of course, sentiment analysis, information extraction, where you're doing like summarization of documents and such, and then also question answering, which Google is doing way more of as of late, as they've just gotten a lot better at it. And just to break this down again on how this works, you start from a corpus. So a corpus is a series of documents that can be on any subject or on every subject. When you think of Google's index, it's a series of corpora that live in a variety of data centers and such. But ultimately, when you're searching, it breaks down that corpus into just a small set of documents, and then it puts those documents in order based on a variety of factors. So when you see that you've searched and it says, there's 100,000 results, think of that as the corpus for that given query. Although Google's full corpus is billions and billions of documents that they've collected through crawling. And again, those documents are ultimately parsed, broken down into, their atomic components as far as their words, and then tagged with parts of speech. And then topics are effectively modeled through a variety of different processes. And, at MozCon, I walked through a number of different ones that can be used, but let's just simplify it right now and say that, there's a variety of different mechanisms used to model topics. And so at that point, search engines then understand how language is used, they extract it, and then they use it themselves to then score those documents and inform those rankings. Google has something that they rolled out last year, at least they rolled out publicly, is an open source project called BERT. And BERT is their, they've essentially made leaps and bounds in natural language processing through these pre-trained models that they use for classification, answering questions, and extracting entities from content. So there's a great article on understanding this, like how it works, from the New York Times. And what they do is they talk about how the library, or library is probably the wrong word. Their approach here is what they've done is they've trained it by having billions of documents and guessing the next word in any given sentence. And so through that, they've been able to train a model that works better than anything else out there. There's a variety of other different types of models that are used for this. There's also Elmo, but BERT is the best one out there. And so really, BERT is what's behind the featured snippets. It's their ability to have a query and then, using their series of documents, determine what the best answer is based on what they've extracted and stored from those documents. So I would encourage you to check out this illustrated explanation of both BERT and Elmo and how they work. It's very in-depth, very technical, but I would still say check this out just so you can better understand these mechanisms and how they work. And if you're following the blog post that Richard Baxter from Built Visible wrote a few years back, where he talked about how to actually trigger the featured snippets, it's a great blog post where he talks about basically having the question that is being asked in a header tag, and then having the answer be very close to that header tag and be optimal for extraction. So if you're seeing it be triggered by, ordered list, then have an ordered list. If you're seeing paragraphs, have a paragraph. If you see a table, have a table. And then ultimately what you do is you resubmit it using URL inspect in Google Search Console. And if you've done it well, then you'll see you have taken that result within the next few hours. But it may be difficult to know what it is that Google would actually extract. And so using this BERT Q&A demo would be a good way for you to test it. So basically take the copy from your page, throw into that paragraph section, and then fill in the different queries, the question queries, to see what would be extracted. So then that way you get a bit of a demonstration of what would be pulled off that page before you even submit it to Google, so you can make sure that what they might extract is more optimal than the things that have already been positioned for the featured snippet by other websites. I think that Cyrus Shepard is a fantastic human being, super smart, and one of the best SEOs that I know. And I really think this blog post that he wrote is a fantastic overview of how these things impact on-page SEO, how these information retrieval concepts come into play for what Google may do. So I think it's a good way for us to just step through these different ways that content is extracted, modeled, and so on. So, of course, keyword usage, that's what we all think of when we think about on-page optimization, actually putting the keywords in your body copy on the page, in your alt text and so on. But again, just going back to how that's understood by a search engine, it goes back to this concept of tokenization. So taking things out of that HTML, breaking it into the series of words, and then using these words to build this understanding. So to take that a little bit further, these tokens can be thought of as engrams. So engrams are phrases of n length, right? So just a single word would be a 1 gram or unigram. 2 words, that's a 2 gram. 3 words, trigram or 3 gram, and it goes as far as is worth looking at. I'm gonna suppose that they may only go up to a 32 gram because that's the longest query that will be processed by Google. But let's just assume for purposes of keyword research and things like that, we're thinking more like 10 grams and such at most. You can actually see all of Google's engrams up until 2006 on the Google AI blog, wherein they made them publicly available. You can download them and play with them as you see fit. And also you've got the Ngram viewer, which is for Google Books, where you can see the incidence rates of different keywords in books across time. So as you can see here in this screenshot, we've got information retrieval, and there's a big spike in the late 80s, early 90s, and it's kind of, tapered off in recent years. But from my perspective, it's still a very important part of our everyday lives because we use search for so many things. Then you've got synonyms and close variants. And so the way that this is understood from an information retrieval perspective is through a concept of stemming. So if you've got the words love, loving, lovingly, loved, lover, a search engine understands those as having all the same core meaning. And then you've got what's called lemmatization. So these are words that have the same inflected form. So if you've got words like better and good, it's understood that those are the same thing, have the same general meaning. And then as you can see in the screenshot, you've got like multiplications, multiples, multiplied, multiply. They all have that same core meaning. So then you got to get into things like semantic distance and term relationships. And that really just comes down to how often are words physically used together, or what's the prominence of different words throughout a series of documents and so on. So when you think about, do we put the keywords in an H1 tag, or are these two words often in the same paragraph? Well, the expectation is that if other people are using these words in this way, then you should also be using them in your page to rank better for those target keywords. So the way that this is done, at least through what's been popularized in the SEO community, is through LDA. And I'm not even going to try and say that middle word. I'm just going to make a fool of myself. But really, it's a recursive algorithm for identifying topics and keywords and then mapping them to each other. And oftentimes when you look at these correlation studies that are done in the SEO space, that is one of the higher on-page or text factors that correlates with good rankings. So you can do this yourself and determine what the LDA scores are for different words using a tool called 9, but we're going to talk a bit more about that later on. So another concept that I want to drill home here, and why I think it's valuable for us to be considering these things, even though a lot of these concepts are pretty old. And, first of all, whenever I see people say, oh, don't look at TF-IDF because it's old. I feel like that's an asinine argument, because just because something old doesn't mean it's valuable. The hypertext transfer protocol is old. FTP is old. All those things are still being used today. But that's my rant. Anyway, so this is a concept called Zipf's law. And the way it works is that it basically indicates that documents are about the same idea have words similarly distributed across them. So if you and I were to write the same document on the same concept, or an article or blog post on the same concept, we would likely use the same words to describe that concept if we both were considered experts on that concept. And so search engines, a lot of the theory and the math behind search engines is built on this, because there is an understanding of that commonality between expressions of the same concept, so you can then rank things based on that context behind the concept. So that brings me to TF-IDF. And TF-IDF is effectively a way to determine commonalities across documents about the same subject. So that's to say that if you have a target keyword, you're looking to see what other keywords are happening in that discussion across that corpus to then infer that context. So to simplify, if we're talking about a keyword like basketball, and everything talking about basketball is featuring LeBron James and crazy free agency, and Russell Westbrook is getting traded. Like, if those are all the things, if those are being discussed in documents that are performant or important on that subject, then if you want to rank for basketball, you should also be talking about those things when you write about basketball. So I think the folks that write have a great explanation of TF-IDF. In fact, it's probably the best one available. And it makes sense because they also have one of the best tools for that as well. And we'll talk about that later on too. Then we've got phrase-based indexing and co-occurrence. I mean, fundamentally, this is looking for some of the similar ideas that we just talked about with TF-IDF, except phrase-based indexing and co-occurrence allow for predictions of what keywords should be on a given page based on that target keyword. So effectively, this is Google's flavor of that idea, and something they came up with. For the patents that are written on this concept, you've got contributors such as like Anna Patterson and Jeff Dean, some of the engineers at Google that have been very involved in how search has evolved over time. So, like I said, a lot of people are talking about TF-IDF being old and we shouldn't focus on it. I expect that Google is using a variety of different concepts, to inform this. It's not just any one thing that we've just said here. And in fact, I think that Bill Slawski's done a great job of talking about this concept of context vectors. Google rolled out a patent on this about 2 years ago, or 3 years ago now, where they talk about using the context of what's being discussed with these words, and the mathematical way that they determine the value around that. That's far more sophisticated than TF-IDF. But nevertheless, I think that there's value in understanding all these things and what the interplay is, and how you can leverage that to get an understanding of what search engines expect. And then there's Heap's law. Heap's law indicates that vocabulary within a corpus around the same subject will grow at a predictable rate. And again, what that is saying is that, if you and I are experts on the same subject, then we are going to continue to use the same words on that subject as that subject evolves. So again, if I'm talking about basketball and there are things that change in basketball, think about basketball commentators when they're on TV talking about free agency. They're going to talk about the same people. They're also going to, use the same terminology to talk about those people, even though the term or the concept of basketball has evolved over time. So again, this is just further indicating that there's a statistical expectation that can be determined based on how people naturally use language and how they talk about subjects. That brings me to entity salience. So search engines, they're basically using the features and the context that go with the people, places, and things that you're talking about. So, it's not just them looking to see, did you mention Barack Obama or did you mention LeBron James? It's also, do the facts that they understand about those entities align with what you've said in your document? And so one of the concepts behind this is called a hidden Markov model. And if you've heard of Markov models in the past, that's probably because you've done content spinning, because a lot of content spinning leverages this. But what hidden Markov models allow you search engines to understand is the implicit relationship between entities. So if you're talking about the Three Stooges, and everyone also always says Larry, Moe, and Curly. Well, if you say Larry and Curly in your document, and you also mention the Three Stooges, then they know that you're implicitly talking about that third person, even if you haven't explicitly mentioned it. So what that's really saying here is that you don't have to say the same keyword over and over and over. There's the ability to write things more naturally because search engines are very sophisticated and they understand how we use language. Entities are also used in verification. So there's a white paper that they published talking about how they can determine the trustworthiness of documents based on using entities. So effectively, if you're writing a bunch of blog posts that say that Donald Trump is a great president, they know your blog post isn't true because there's a lot of information across the internet that say otherwise. And then there's page segmentation, which really just comes down to, again, the idea of prominence and where things live throughout a document to determine its value. So the things that are at the top of the page that are in the main body are considered more important than the things that are at the bottom or in a sidebar or something like that. So my whole point here is that search engines are recursive and they develop an expectation based on the things that they've already indexed and they've ranked well. And so there's this understanding that we can parse out and leverage in what we're doing so that we can be more effective in meeting that expectation. We need to understand that expectation and then use that to build out requirements for our content so that we can rank better. So what should we be doing? I've given you a ton of theory, and I definitely want to not just be giving you theory. I want to talk through this in actionable ways so that you can make even small changes to your approaches and, see some of the results that we see on our side. So when I think about this whole like ecosystem of content and how you do it and things like that and who you're targeting, I've long been a proponent of personas, and I've always thought of Google as just a additional persona that we're accounting for. I like how AJ Cohn calls it the blind 5-year-old. And really, we need to understand those search engine expectations through keyword research and natural language processing. And we also need to meet the expectations of both our audience personas and our buyer personas. And so what this Venn diagram here is illustrating is that if you focus on, different overlaps of these areas, it yields different things. So if you're focused on your audience personas, the people that don't necessarily buy from you, but they consume your content, and you're also focused on your buyer personas, well, you're going to have content that doesn't really drive traffic. It's going to be content that may work to ultimately, drive sales and such, but it doesn't necessarily drive traffic. However, if you then bring in that context of what search engines expect, you're now doing what we're calling full funnel SEO, and we're able to drive that traffic and meet the expectations of the audience, drive those links, those MQLs and that referral traffic, and then those SQLs and conversions as well. So what it comes down to is 3 steps based on everything I've said to you thus far. Researching the content and the expectations, and then creating content that fulfills those expectations. Building relevant links, so links that have parity on both sides, getting links from pages that are about what your page talks about, and then further testing and optimizing your body copy and your metadata so that we can drive way more clicks and visits and so Rand's old diagram here where it's like put the keyword in the page title, put in the H1, sprinkle it in the body copy, put it in your alt text. Really, we need to be doing more of this more advanced on page targeting that Cyrus has talked about, where it's like thinking about the prominence of keywords, thinking about the frequency, but not in the keyword density way, like more about how do we use this naturally to speak to people, but also meet the expectations of the usage that search engines have. And then also using those entities, having that structured data in there, and using the co-occurring keywords that are expected by based on what's already performing, and making sure that ultimately all of these things that we're doing in this multi-dimensional word game still make sense to users. And again, it starts with keyword research. And if your keyword research looks like what we're seeing on the screen right now, still, I, I don't even know why you're watching this webinar. You're probably not going to do anything different. But I've also been a proponent of very detailed keyword research for a long time now, and our approach that we call persona-driven keyword research, which we've continued to iterate on and pull more of the SERP features into it, and also pull entities and things like that. That allows us to really have a good picture of what that content strategy needs to speak to, and allows us to create these content briefs that allow us to further optimize in this direction. So if you're still doing keyword research like this, please just check out my old presentation on persona driven keyword research, and then also start adding in a lot of the things you're hearing from Kane Jameson, and also working in entities. And then you're going to be in a much better place so that you can execute on some of the things that we're talking about here. So ultimate goal is to figure out which keywords we need to be using with our target keywords, what entities we need to be speaking to, and then how do we massage all of that into content that people actually want to read. There's no SEO tools. No, let me take that back. There are not granular SEO tools that do each component of this stuff in the way that I'm describing that you ultimately need to. And so I'd like to introduce you to a data mining tool called Nime Analytics, which does do much of or many of these concepts for building your topic models. So Nime is cool because it doesn't require you to be a data scientist or know statistics really. I mean, if you want your things to be right, you probably should start to know more about this stuff, but you can start playing around and come up with proofs of concept, and then work with your data science team to better understand how things work, just by doing drag and drop analysis with this tool. So any of these icons here represents a different, action that you want the data to be processed through. And then ultimately you can leverage that to get an output that you actually are more comfortable with, that you can then play with in Excel. So you're going to need the text processing extension to do a lot of the analysis that search engines are doing. And there's all that talk about context vectors. Word vectors are technically different, but you can accomplish a lot of that understanding that's going on with the determination of context vectors by using some of the more deep learning text processing tools and playing around with word vectors. Again, they're not exactly the same thing, but they're going to help you get part way to some of the answers that Google is able to drive with context vectors. And then you're also going to need the HTTP extension that Palladium creates so that you can connect to pages and extract features and so on to then do this analysis. So for any given keyword, you need to start with a corpus. And, just to be very clear here, we are never going to have the access to the complete corpus that Google has, because for any given keyword, they may have millions of documents. And if you've ever tried to venture into the depths that are like page 100 for the SERPs, more often than not, Google stops returning results after like page 20 or 30, and so you would never be able to even scrape the entire corpus for any given keyword. That said, what we do have readily available is the data from SEMrush, which will allow us to pull back the top 100 results. So as an example here, if I'm looking for a corpus for SEO tools, I would pull this 100 documents and then use that as my corpus. So this would be a starter workflow to allow you to start playing around with some of these concepts. So this will allow you to compute both LDA and TF-IDF. And so what this is doing is it's taking a CSV of your 100 documents, and then it's running it through the HTML retrieval, and then it's parsing it, it's extracting the content, it's running a series of different taggers. So parse the speech tagger, Abner tagger, it's erasing punctuation. It's then converting everything to lowercase. It's pulling out stop words. It's breaking it down to what's called the bag of words. And then it's taking those tags and converting them to strings. And then it's computing LDA and also computing TF-IDF. LDA gives it to you in a tag cloud, and TF-IDF is going to give it to you in a bar chart. So at this point, you would now have a data set to indicate what words are actually being used for these pages that are currently ranking in the top 100. So if you are still not feeling like doing what we just described with KNIME, you can actually use a couple SEO tools to do some of this stuff as well. So, if you go to SEMrush, put in your domain, you can see where you don't rank well organically. So in this case, we're looking for a keyword like what does SEO stand for, where Moz ranks number 86. And so at that point, you want to look at the SERP, see what's going on there, what features are in the SERP to further inform not just what is ranking well, but also inform what's going on. Is this an informational query? Is this a transactional query? And then, you want to see what's ranking number one. So in this case, this page, I don't really understand how that's your number one result, but here we are. And then look at your page that actually ranks for it. So in this case, this is the page that ranks number 86, chapter 3 of the Beginner's Guide to SEO. Kind of ridiculous to me, but here we are. And then you would also want to see what else could rank for your site. So if you put in the site calling query with the query that you're looking to rank for, you're then going to see in order the documents that would rank for that query based on how Google feels about your site. So if there's a better page on your site, there's some opportunity for optimization and keyword targeting, not just the on page itself, but with the internal linking structure, external links, and so on. At this point, you can then go to Wright's Content Success Tool, which is effectively a TF-IDF tool. These are older screenshots because we've been using it for a long time. And so in this case, you put in the keyword, what does SEO stand for? Excuse me, sorry about that. What does SEO stand for? And then you're going to get this bar chart, which indicates the weighting of those words being used on the pages that Content Success crawled. And then the green line graph indicates the weighting, the usage of those words on your page. And so as you can see here, many of the words that are considered important here are not being used on Moz's page. You can also see what other pages they pulled in to use as a corpus. So as you can see here, there's about 10 pages. And again, when we go through this process using KNIME, we have 100 pages to pull from so we can have a better indication of that expectation. At this point, you would then drop in your copy into their content optimizer tool, and then it's going to tell you which words you're using too much, which words you should use more, and which words you should think of adding to what you're writing. And I don't think it's as simple as just like shoving these keywords into existing places throughout the content. I think you also need to be thinking about like, how do we add more to this discussion so that we're using these words the right way? Here's some examples of results that we get from this process. And so in this case, all the keywords that you're going to see are competitive Medicare related terms, minimum monthly search volume of 8,100. I think one of these keywords is up to 15,000. And so as you can see here, for the top one, we started at a rank of 40. We did these type of optimizations. And then over time, not only did we drop to the top 10 within a few months, but ultimately it went to number one. Same thing for the next query. So in this one, we were ranking, 100. And in fact, we weren't ranking at all when we did our content optimization. And that one dropped into the top 10 in a couple months. And then also ranked number one over time. Goodness gracious. And here's another example. Again, starting at ranking 100, did the content optimization over a couple months. It dropped to number one and pretty much stayed there, except for a few spikes here and there. And yeah, again, no link building was done. This was actually done pretty much in a vacuum, the things that we just described here. So there's also Search Metrics' content experience tool, which I think is great in that it supports the same things that we do with content success, but it makes it very easy for the creation of content that's net new. So you do your research around topics. So you put in your keyword. In this case, I was looking up Game of Thrones theories, and then it gives you all the tangentially related concepts to it, so you can then build out a content brief. So when you create this brief, you're identifying the core topics. You're either indicating whether or not it's a new page or a page that you're making in the future. I mean, excuse me, a page that already exists. And then once you start writing, it's going to make the different direction or give you the different direction on what to do. So in this case, I just Googled Game of Thrones theories and then threw in the content, and it indicates, okay, you're using these must-have keywords X number of times. It's indicating recommendations around other keywords. And there's a series of other recommendations that this tool makes to help you write and meet those expectations that a search engine will have. And then there's also SEM Rush's tool. They've got this writing assistant tool. I haven't actually used it yet, but it's a plugin for Google Docs, so that as you write, it gives you those same types of scores, and it also scores readability to just give you more direction. And there's also another tool called Phrase.io, and then some other folks have mentioned to me Market Muse. And again, these are all other tools I haven't used, but just more options that do these things. So you also want to be A/B testing your metadata, creating different titles and meta descriptions, and putting different buckets together and testing to see which ones yield higher click-through rates. And the way you want to get started with that is just compare your click-through rate with industry standard click-through rate. So you can take your CTR from Search Console and then compare it to your vertical specific CTR that they're seeing across any given industry in the AWR CTR study. And so if you see anything that is underperforming, that should inform your different hypotheses so you can determine whether or not you're meeting that expected click-through rate like we talked about before. And for keyword discovery, I would say check out WordNet. That's just a good way to identify variants so that you can put into your keyword research process. And you should also think about automating the inclusion of emerging keywords based on Google Search Console. So the way you would approach that would be to keep a database of your target keywords. And as you see any keywords that you're starting to get a lot more clicks for or a lot more impressions for, and if it's not already on your list, you can automatically add that to your ranking tool via whatever API might be in use. And I know for Stat, they have an API, so it's pretty easy. And I know most of these other tools do as well. And just vet that there's actual search volume around those keywords before you do so, because otherwise you'd be clouded with a bunch of keywords that don't drive search volume and aren't really worth optimizing for. And GrepWords is a great tool to vet that against. And you also want to review your importance of a given entity on any given page. And if you want to think about more intelligent link building, especially internal link building, you can leverage that same information to determine which entities are relevant on each side. So let's say we're talking about you've got a landing page for BMW. Well, you want to also see other pages throughout the site that have that entity association with it, so that you can have the parity between the links across both sides of that link. There's Google's API, or excuse me, NLP API that you can leverage. It's great, and it's also going to be as close to us understanding Google's understanding of entities. But Watson's Knowledge Studio is also pretty awesome too. And I like the way that they visualize the entities within the content. So they've got a tool where if you plug in your content, it'll highlight the different entities, and then you can hover over and see their usage throughout your content. And then there's also Diffbot, which allows you to crawl a website and do these different types of entity extractions. Monkey Learn, great for doing all types of analysis. So if you're doing any classification, we use this pretty heavily in our keyword research. And if you're uncomfortable with using APIs, I would encourage you to check out Nime's solution for that. So again, I told you can do all this different type of analysis using this drag and drop interface. So you can connect to APIs and then extract the data from the API into a tabular form, and then use that within Excel just as easy as you use Excel as it stands. I envision a world where all of the stuff that is happening here with algorithmic driven understanding of content, and also the capability to develop content in an algorithmically driven way, becoming this very much like algorithm versus algorithm environment, where you've got an algorithm that represents you, that filters out only things you want to see, and then the algorithms are of course filtering out things that are worth being seen in general. And so when I was talking about machine learning a couple years ago, I was talking about this concept of natural language generation, and something you should avoid because it's really just a more sophisticated version of content spinning. But as technology has improved, I realize I'm wrong. There's going to be a lot of opportunity around natural language generation in the coming years, and it's something that we should probably embrace as SEOs, so that we can figure out ways to scale content that speaks to people, speaks to buyer personas, and also meets those expectations of our users and search engines. So I suspect that over the next 5 years, natural language generation will probably be one of the next big things. And there's some companies that are already ahead of it. But again, I don't know that they're as sophisticated as what I just described, but we're inching our way there. So there's a company called Phrase Tech that's been doing stuff like this, and a lot of e-commerce sites use it. If you're looking at sites like eBay and you go to a men's watches page or something like that, and you see that there's a wealth of content, that type of content is generated using data models informed by natural language generation. So these models can be taught things like voice and tone and so on, and ultimately yield the type of content that we've always talked about having people create. So I suspect in the near future, there's going to be a very sophisticated version of this that we're not going to be able to tell the difference between that and an actual person writing. And there's stuff like that right now. Narrative science and automated insights do that with like sports wrap ups and things like that. But again, I don't know that stuff is as great as what can be done in the near future. So wrapping it up, really what it comes down to is determining the search engine expectations, optimizing your content accordingly, and then testing everything that you can to make sure you're fulfilling that expectation. And ultimately that helps you win the SERPs. So I'm Mike King. We're iPullRank. Please follow us at iPullRank Agency. You may already be following me, but I mostly just talk trash on the internet, and I like to intersperse it with some thoughtful things as well. But if you want more signal and less noise, I'd encourage you to follow the agency Twitter. This is our CEO. Just want to give a shout out to Zora. And we're incorporating a lot of this natural language processing stuff into our processes, and using it to be very effective at meeting these expectations of search engines. So please get. I may have lost you guys. Hold on. I lost my Wi-Fi for a second. Let me see if I can find the right window. Hmm. One second. Oh, there we go. Okay, I'm back. So yeah, that's all I got. You guys got any questions? Or did any questions come up as we went by? Let's see here. hmm Oh, John Henry here to give me a hard time. Let's see what we got. Mike is bad. TF-IDF is bad. No accounting for semantics or syntactics. Blah, blah, blah. Blah, blah, blah. TF-IDF not valid. Yeah, I think Kane said how I feel about it. um, Mike King comment section is like visiting R. I am very smart. Do 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 do. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Where can we download the presentation? So the presentation is on my slide share. I'm gonna grab that link real quick for you. I think it is. If it's not, we'll tweet out whatever the link is. Yep, here it is. All right. Yeah, Jeremy already shared it. Where can we get the NIME workflow? I mean, yeah, I can save the file, but you could also pretty much build it yourself just by dragging and dropping the same thing. Um, yeah, I'll ultimately share it. I'll probably end up writing a blog post around this stuff. Can you refer us to any presentations, articles, blog posts that continue this discussion? I would say that Bill Slawski he's definitely written the most about this stuff, at least in our world. But there's a lot of great blogs around like science. So I think it's towarddatascience.com. I think there's another one called NLPnuggets.com. These are the sites that I read more so because I want to understand this stuff from like a more actionable perspective, not just like the theoretical perspective. So I would just encourage you to just like Google more around natural language processing and such. Let's see. What's next for iPullRank? We're just continuing to do things that, or at least I think, are innovative. I found myself personally get pretty bored with SEO over the last couple of years, which is why I found myself like just really digging into the computer science stuff, which is more natural for me, and just really trying to understand how search works, because I think there's a lot of things that we say like it depends, or nobody knows, and it can't just be that, because Google gets new search engineers all the time. These people have to have some sort of context that they start from to be able to add on to what Google is doing. And so it's been very important to me to understand that context and then bring that back to what we do as SEOs. So one, I can better understand what we're all talking about. And two, we can come up with more actionable things that are worth doing. So there's been so much talk about entities over the last like 5 years. And it's so amazing to me that like we keep putting it out there like entities are important. But there is nothing in our world that tells us how to use that. So, I ultimately want to get much better at us leveraging that, and also us as an industry, not just like talking about things from a theoretical perspective, but also figuring out how we can use that stuff. So in answer to your question, we're just going to try to keep intense, actional, that wraps up all specific contents that get deep into specific points of the topic. I think that's exactly it. I think that's exactly what we should be doing. Um, I think even before we even think of it on this granular level, we have to be thinking, or we've always been thinking in SEO, is like, how do we have these resource centers? How do we have more and more content that speaks to frequently asked questions and things like that? So I think that we have already directionally been doing these types of things. It's just that we've just been saying, okay, let's just make content. But there's so much that we can leverage to understand how we should be making that content so that it ultimately moves the needle. So yeah, I think that we should definitely be doing exactly what you're describing. That's just more allowing us to be more granular and more focused on what is that user intent, and in addition to what is that user context that we should be creating content for. Because I completely believe that as Google becomes more and more of a filter bubble, and it's more of your algorithmic avatar that represents you, it's going to be more and more about who has the more specific content for my persona than being the broad content. I believe it was Joy Hawkins who says there is a separate algorithm for Google for local SEO. Do you believe this, or do you believe it's the same algorithm, just different factors that are being used as you stated in your document scoring section? Yeah, like I said, I think that there is scoring functions for a variety of things. It's not just one master scoring function being used. And I think this is evidenced best when you think about how SERPs around like pills, porn, and poker are very different from SERPs around most other things, right? And so to that end, there's definitely a different scoring function for local, and different scoring functions for like car insurance versus today's news or what have you. I completely believe that. Distilling down the various technical options, presented broad strokes, soup to nuts process on how to do it, keyword corpus for a keyword, some sort of NLP or a LDA, TF-IDF processing what you're missing versus competitors versus in high ranking pages. Am I missing any pieces? I think that's the general idea of what we're saying, and I think that when I say, don't just use TF-IDF, that's partially why I'm saying there are all these other potential ways that can be used to model topics. And so um, when we do it, we're like, okay, what can we learn from TF-IDF? What can we learn from LDA? What can we learn from the entities that other people are using here? And then we bring all that into a series of notes or a brief to then inform how we're going to create or how we're going to optimize that content. So yeah, it's getting as much information as possible from all those different mechanisms to then use to determine what words you should be using in your content. Just an aside, no way of knowing if it's Crowdcast or your Wi-Fi. Things froze. Yeah, it's definitely my Wi-Fi. We're in a WeWork. Wi-Fi is trash, and we're gonna move soon. So sorry. Maybe what I'll do is I'll just do a recording at home and then upload that as well. But we'll see what the quality of the recording is once I actually get on. Any other questions? If not, we're gonna send you guys some follow-up emails, and they'll include the video. They'll also include the wow. They'll include some links to some blog posts that we've written and so on, and just some more resources to help you all do more. So is your persona driven keyword research info webinar available online? I don't think I ever did a webinar with that one. That was just a talk that I gave a bunch of times. Maybe there is some value in us revisiting that, just because like we've altered the approach just a bit. As we started moving mobile first indexing, do you think the scoring weight around speed has grown significantly? Should it be another area of focus in addition to content? New follower, and don't know if you've discussed this already. Um, I think with speed, I mean, Google has said previously that like it's something that's used in the algorithm. But when I think about speed, I think it's important in two ways. One, when we talk about mobile friendliness, speed is a factor to mobile friendliness. I think, you know, we're more used to saying like, oh, is the page responsive or adaptive or whatever. But I think speed is a key component to that, because Google has very aggressive expectations of page speed on mobile. They expect the above the fold content to load within 1 second, which is very hard to do. Um, so, but I think it's more that there's a level of computational expense that comes with crawling, right? And so the longer it takes for a page to load, the less they're going to crawl you. So you have less opportunity for things to rank. I think that's important even before you think about, is speed a factor in that scoring function? I think it's more important does Google have more opportunity to discover and see and index your content to then consider it? More so than, is it a ranking factor? Do you have a template for the persona driven keyword research? I think there's a template in that presentation. I can't remember. If not, we also have a blog post about that. I've been thinking about updating it. So yeah, we will make that available. Any last questions? I know we're over, but 50 of you stuck around, so I want to make sure you get your money's worth. Have you tried including sentiment analysis in your research? No, we have not. So in previous tools that we used to build internally, or I used to build in at other agencies as well, we did take a look at sentiment analysis, but I never saw any like impact from making adjustments around sentiment. So we don't use it. And I don't know. I mean, Bill can probably speak better to this, or he's probably written blog posts about this. But I don't know if there's been any mention of sentiment analysis and how Google has been ranking standard organic results. So I'm going to stick around for 3 more minutes if you guys have any more questions. Okay, well, I guess there isn't anything else. Oh, wait, here we go. Overall page load, different elements, blah, 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 or not blah, blah, blah. I'm sorry. Yeah. I mean, I think the more important one to be looking at is time to interactive, because of the fact that if something loads and you can't use it, then is it loaded? If you can't look at the page, what's the point? So yeah, I tend to look at time to interactive, but of course we look at everything just to see where there's opportunities to further optimize. Nah, I'm not rapping. If you want to see me rap, there's like videos of that. There's like tons of videos of that. And I don't even mean in the SEO context. Anything else? Anybody typing? Maybe not. All right, so I'm going to close this elegantly and thank everyone for coming, and those of you who um, you know, engaged in the discussion. Very much appreciate you. And like I said, if there's anything we can help you out with, please feel free to reach out. And yeah, thanks for attending. Peace.